Hey everyone, thanks for stopping by. I hope everyone's been enjoying the conference so far. I've been in a few of the sessions, and it's been great to see everyone talking about data, modern data stack, all the type of topics that we're all into. Um, so yeah, I'm excited to talk about open source. Let me share my screen. Let's share. Awesome. I hope everyone can see this. Thanks again for coming. And yeah, today I'll be talking about open source communities. So basically, really trying to understand open source communities using the modern data stack. And it's a little bit circular here. I think open source communities have actually made the modern data stack possible. So it's kind of interesting to understand what makes a community successful, if you're running a community or managing a community, the types of activities that you can do to help grow and nurture that community. And the fun meta thing here is that I'll talk a little bit towards the end of my presentation about how we're actually using the modern data stack internally to actually understand our community. So it's kind of a nice little modern data stack inception. So we'll get into it. So I just want to provide a quick overview of kind of the main things I'll be going over in this talk. So first, what makes a community successful? So really actually defining what a community is and how we kind of measure its success, and even qualitatively, what does it feel like to be in one of these thriving communities? Second part, ways of supporting and nurturing community growth. So what are the actual levers that you have to help grow your community and make everyone feel included? Three, I'll talk specifically about some of the applications ideas. So I help run a community, which I'll talk about in just a second, and I'll talk a little bit about how we actually apply those ideas in our own community. So putting some of this to action. And then lastly, I'll end with some of the data tooling that we've built that we're hoping to open source and let others use as well. But as a data company, we kind of wanted to build, in this case, instead of buy, and I'll kind of showcase the work that we've done over the last 18 months or so to build some basic tooling and infrastructure, all powered by open source, to basically support this effort. So I don't see anything in the chat, so I think, okay, looks like we're good. So a little bit about myself. I'm a committer to the Apache Superset project. I'm a senior developer advocate at Preset. We're basically helping to support and offer a commercialized version of Superset. And before joining 18 months ago, I spent 7 years in data science and data science education. So I'm really interested in how we can help spread this type of data literacy. How do we help all types of people understand how to work with and get value out of data, interpret it correctly, and use it to kind of drive insights, especially in a team in a business setting. So that's kind of what I'm excited about. So I joined Preset to help advocate for better data tooling, and help kind of support the community around it, help with educational efforts, etc. Before joining Preset, I spent 5 years helping scale up DataQuest, an online learning platform for data science. So for people who are in this space, you may have heard of it. And yeah, basically hoping to bring what I've learned, helping others learn data skills, to helping build communities around data tooling. So that's kind of my passion. So first things first, right? What actually makes a community successful? So my somewhat facetious answer is you kind of know it when you feel it. So it's similar to product market fit that people talk about. You have customers that are banging down your door, that are asking for more features. They want to quickly add more seats. If it's a subscription software business, you kind of just feel it. You feel this kind of growth that's latent. You have people that are very excited and kind of need your product. One of the ways is to ask your customers, if we disappeared, like, what would you do? Like, how strongly would you feel about it, right? So that's kind of in the product market fit land, kind of like how you sense it, right? But more concretely, right? Like, how do we actually know? How do we get away from just the feel and into something more practical that we can start to measure? So first, I think community is growing in activity and engagement without direct intervention. So when a community is just starting out, you need to pour a lot of energy and love into the community so that people have something to do. They can get their questions answered. In the case of software communities, and there's just kind of some baseline of an experience that people get. And usually in the beginning, when it's just 10 people, 50 people, 100 people, you have to do a lot of direct intervention to actually make that happen. But the hope is that that's not very scalable, and you don't want to keep doing that forever. So if the community is growing kind of some degree without you, like if you go on vacation for 2 weeks and it's still active and thriving, that's a good sign. 2, members start to take ownership and volunteer. So people kind of switch from wanting things to actually helping the community. They kind of are excited. They see gaps in the community and they want to raise their hand and volunteer, and just unpaid. They just want to, help take more ownership. You see this in communities like Reddit, where people become moderators, and it's completely unpaid. They just do this because they feel kind of part of the community and they want to give back in some way. So that's obviously a great sign. 3, members feel like they're part of a movement. So some communities have a strong opinion, and they're not. They want to really kind of build the community around that movement. They have a set of potentially controversial and strong ideas, and it's kind of, people feel like they're really in a movement when they join this community. Great example, which I'll come back to multiple times in this talk, is DBT. They built a really great community around analytics engineering. They really feel like databases are awesome, SQL is awesome. Let's really empower domain experts to own their kind of destiny when it comes to data, and not have to feel like they're just waiting for some other team to unblock them, right? So they have this strong opinion, and they built a community around that. 4, healthy distribution of people across all commitment and orbit levels. So I'll talk about the orbit model in the next slide, but you basically have a healthy mix of people. It's quite hard to build a community full of only highly engaged, super active contributors. There's just always different tiers of commitment levels people have, but you want a healthy distribution. You don't want only people that are joining and wanting something. You also want others to kind of to be at a higher commitment level so they can help pull everyone else up. So that's kind of really the goal here. And lastly, community is self-sustaining to some degree. So people want to fork off and start their own meetups, and they want to, they really feel attached to the community, and they're not, it's kind of, maybe they sometimes feel like it's not even really related to the original team of people who started. It's really kind of that self-sustaining energy. So for people who are running communities, the orbit model is a really powerful framework for understanding. It's basically a replacement for the funnel. So a lot of people try to view community and developer relations, which is the type of work that I do, as a funnel activity. Like, oh, we just need to get all of these people to a certain level, and then they might pay us one day. And I think that's a very challenging and a difficult way to look at it, mostly because it's a little too short-sighted. It's really hard to build a community when you view everyone as a potential buyer. They're just a few weeks away from buying. It doesn't really match the reality as well of a lot of communities, especially in open source software, where a large portion of your community may never want a commercial offering. So that's something, that's kind of the first kind of ice that I want to unfreeze in people's brains. So what replaces the funnel model? A great team has come up with this idea called the orbit model. There's now a company called Orbit. If you go to orbit.love, you can see that they have this whole philosophy. Interesting enough, and not surprisingly, they also have a community, and they also it's full of people that believe in this idea, right? So they're really living it, which is awesome. So what is the orbit model? Basically, the way it works is people kind of start out in the outer orbit. So they start out by getting aware of your community or your product, or in my case, the open source project. And then they, just with a little bit more energy, they become a level 4 orbiter. I think that's the word they use, orbiter. So they get a little bit of love. So how do they even get from awareness to exploring? They feel some love. Maybe they come to your website, they feel welcome. It looks interesting. So they begin to explore it. A smaller portion of them end up participating. So people who join the community wherever it may be, and actually engage with others. They participate, they come to events. It's still relatively low commitment, but they are still kind of engaging more than just kind of exploring and looking at the landscape. And when you get to level 2, that's really when it's a much smaller group. You'll notice, right? These, as you increase in orbit love, it's a smaller and smaller group, and this is just kind of the reality, right? There's just less people who are so committed and bought in that they're contributing in some way. They're kind of sacrificing non-trivial amount of time and energy towards the community, towards the project. And again, for open source, this is everything from opening bug requests, feature requests, and in some cases even fixing them themselves, like actually shipping code, right, for an open source project. And lastly, we have building. So this is people who are then going and maybe they're building on the work you've done. They're contributing plugins. They're building secondary tools and integrate with your tool, right? And this is a much smaller percentage. This is obviously the smallest percentage of people in the community, but so you want a healthy mix. You want people at every one of these levels, and this is something I can attest to from my own experience at DataQuest as well, and where we had a student community and we had people at every level here. We had people who were just starting out. We had people who were also experts, and it can be sometimes difficult to keep the experts around because they are, in some ways, they kind of don't need the community. So they kind of are mature enough that they can go out on their own and succeed. So you want to make sure that you have something for each level to continue to stick around, continue to feel like they want to help build this community with you. And lastly, you have the center of gravity, which is your team, right? This could be, in my cases, I'm the main person that runs community stuff, and I also partner with folks in the community and at work on community efforts. But in some cases, it might be a team, a professional team, 30 or 50 people even for larger communities. So that's obviously going to be a small cohort. So your goal really is to get more people up this, to graduate from each level, each orbit level. And, it does resemble a funnel in some ways, except that, you don't necessarily want to view these folks at the highest level as customers, which is the main difference, I would say, between orbit and funnel. So how does this actually happen? Like, how do people move from 4 to 3, 3 to 2, that type of thing? I think the biggest thing, having participated in now about 20 different communities, and if you look at my Slack, you'll see that I have over 20 logos because of all the communities that I'm in. This is kind of one of the side effects of working in developer relations, I suppose. So how do people actually graduate, right? And I think if there's just one thing, there's just one piece of advice, it's you really have to start by giving, with really not much expectation of return, especially in the short run. This means taking every question or comment very personally and actually responding and acknowledging, at least to some degree. It doesn't mean saying yes to every feature idea, but it does mean that you're actively engaging with every single person because they've put in the effort. It may not feel like much, like, oh, how hard is it for someone to just come by and open a feature request, but they still took time out of their day and they're still interested enough that they felt like this warranted even that amount of effort. So you really want to give as much as possible, and especially when you have a new community. In some ways, people with new communities have a challenge, but they also have a blessing, and that the blessing is they get to really dictate and experiment and start from scratch. And it's very different than, I came into a community that already had 3,000 people. And so there's a lot of baggage and existing stuff, right? So for starting fresh, give a lot and don't expect much in return. The logos below are communities that have done this, I would say, really well. So DBT, as I mentioned earlier, Meltano, Airbyte, Trino, Timescale DB, the Apache Peanut community. So if you go to those Slack communities, you will see that the core team is very active. They're really making sure they're on top of every single item, question, bug, whatever, right? They're at least acknowledging. And the more successful ones, I would say, that have scaled out, especially DBT and even Airbyte to some degree in Meltano, they have other people in the community now. So people at orbit level 2 or 3, they're now actually stepping in and feeling that ownership, and they're not kind of waiting for the core team necessarily to answer. Two, content is king, right? So in a community, I use the word content in the broadest sense. I have a few specific ones here, but it's pretty difficult to build a community when there isn't some type of content. So in the beginning, it could just be Slack messages, people asking questions. The hope is that you graduate to things that have more staying power and are more engaging, require a little bit more commitment, meetups, events, documentation. So if someone is kind of excited enough that they actually want to document some functionality, then that's great. Blog posts, tutorials, right? Some of the best communities have a large percentage, if not the plurality of this type of content coming from members of the community, not from the core team that wants the community to succeed, right? That's really how you know. And three, explicitly acknowledge and reward members that want to play a bigger role. So there are always people who get to that level 3, level 2, acknowledge them, right? Like give them swag, give them access, and just reward them, give them create a champions program if that makes sense, and just show them love and actually like explicitly acknowledge that these type of people are doing out of kind of ordinary work. So I think that's super important, really important in a community. People want to feel that the work is being rewarded. So that's kind of a primer, I would say, on community building. So I'll transition a little bit to the community that I'm involved with. And to start, I'll talk about Superset. So Apache Superset is a modern open source BI platform, BI standing for business intelligence. And so we have a no code and a SQL editor as well. So kind of two different experiences for people to create charts and build dashboards. It's kind of the main focus. And because we're open source and very kind of modern native, cloud native architecture, we work with nearly any SQL speaking data engine. We have a large diversity of charts, and both of these can be custom configured. So if you invent a new database tomorrow, you can build an adapter, your chart type, that type of thing. The other thing I'll quickly mention is kind of the why for the community and the why for the project. So Max was working in Airbnb, and him and his team were constantly frustrated with proprietary software, right? They were running into all types of limitations. They wanted to use these new wave data engines like Druid and Presto, and Tableau just didn't have support for it at the time. And they also wanted to scale access to thousands of people, and paying $50 to $100 a pop a month for licensing just for that was a big limitation. So they decided to start an open source community around an alternative, which ended up being Superset. So I mention this because this kind of is one of the most consistent things I see in the community when I engage with people. People are there because they're a little bit fed up with proprietary software, and they want something that gives them more freedom. And that ultimately is kind of the seed that's launched the community. And that's when people join the community, that's the consistent story that they hear, and that's why they join. They're joining because they identify with Max and his team's struggles 5 years ago, and they want to see, is this the better way? Is this the way forward? So for some additional context as well, in terms of the scale of our community, so I just took this screenshot today. We're almost at 5,000. Maybe some folks here watching this talk will join and push this over. But that's super exciting. When I joined, I think we were around 2,700 or so. So in 18 months, we're kind of close to doubling, which is great. About 10% are active every week. Still, that's the number I sweat a lot about. I always want to see that higher. We're a top 200 GitHub project, so just a massive footprint. Over 41,000 stars on GitHub as well. These are vanity metrics, but I think they just help set the stage on, it's been around for 5 years. I came into an existing community, and so these are some of the scale that I have to think about, and the team and I have to think about. But with great scale comes kind of great responsibility and interesting data problems. And so naturally, since we're a bunch of data nerds, we decided to use open source tools to build our own internal community tracker. And so we use a number of components, and this is constantly changing, but this is kind of our current architecture. So we call this the community tracker. We use Airbyte to suck up data from the different channels that our community lives on. So GitHub and Slack are our two most important ones. Eventually, we'd like to add things like Stack Overflow and and Reddit as well, but these two are 99% of where people are engaging with and discussing Superset. So this is the GitHub repo for Superset. This is the Apache Superset Slack. We also have Google Analytics just so that we can see where people are viewing documentation articles. And so this is kind of not quite community, but this is just understanding the impact of content outside of those two channels. That data feeds into a database that we have. We use both RDS and BigQuery actually for this, just for a little bit of because it's also a fun little experiment for us, and it's not too much data. So we have Postgres, and we also use BigQuery as well. And so we have a staging database where the raw data comes in. The raw data is very not friendly for analysis. So that's naturally where dbt comes in. So we have a variety of dbt models that have been built up over the last year. We run those, and then they transform the data, and then we have a final community data schema, which we can then feed into Superset. We also have experimented a bit with Airflow so that this can all be kind of orchestrated and triggered and managed in a reliable way. So that's a little bit about the tech stack. So how have we actually put some of the ideas that I mentioned earlier to action? So we've done a number of things. This is really just a snapshot. I think these are some of the more impactful ones, and some of them seem pretty simple. It may not work necessarily for your community, but I can kind of go through each one of them. So in our Slack community, we have monthly newsletters and bi-weekly Slack updates, and these are by far the most engaging pieces of content that we put out. They only take about an hour to put together, but it's also a great way for us to hold ourselves accountable to make sure that we create interesting content, educational content, because if we don't, then we're going to have a pretty bland update and pretty bland newsletter. So it's nice kind of accountability mechanism, but the spikes that we see in engagement and kind of people reactivating in the community is huge after we send these out. Welcome bot is something I implemented pretty early on. So when anyone joins the community, they get pinged by the welcome bot. They kind of get shown the code of conduct, introduction to some of the channels, and they're pointed to the introduction channels. You're not required to put an introduction, but that is kind of one of the metrics we also look at to see if people are joining with excitement because of word of mouth, et cetera, and then they decide to introduce themselves because they're excited to be there, right? That's kind of an interesting thing that we also track. I cut the number of channels in half. So we had a lot of channels. There was just no grooming. People just created channels without much purpose. And we got rid of the general channel, actually, because that became a dumping ground for just random things, right? And so we really just retooled our channels to be very focused. We have a using Superset channel. We have a customizing Superset channel, a deploying Superset, a feature, feature requests, beginner questions. So there's only 8 channels, or I think maybe 9 now, and they're very focused. And then we also we repurposed our general channel to be more of a community announcements channel, and only I and admins can post in there as well. So it's a very, very focused channel. I generally recommend. I still see some communities with a general channel. I'm not a big fan of it because it's as the name suggests, it's too general. I think it's much better to have specific channels that you really make sure you staff with a few people that are grooming it and feeling some ownership there. Ideally, some of your level 2 orbit champions. Speaking of champions, we did experiment a few times with a champions program. It can be hard to have a champions program because you do need to spend a lot of time engaging with them and making sure that they are getting value, not only that they are engaging and helping out community members. So we're going to continue to iterate here. But a champions program is a great way to show some love and to kind of recognize those people, give them badges and swag so they feel that ownership. Then in GitHub is interesting because in some ways it kind of bleeds over the edge of just community work. It bleeds into the open source Apache workflow. So we have like 50 committers and what are called PMC members. It's all Apache lingo for just 2 different tiers of people that are very core to the open source project. And so we started doing things like, let's aim to acknowledge every GitHub issue at least. And then we have over 1,000 now. We can't certainly fix everything or give very detailed responses, but let's at least acknowledge and give every issue an owner. So there's some accountability there. And whenever someone makes, PRs are that last, we consider the last tier of orbit level, right? Someone is actually creating a code contribution or a documentation contribution. It's only a few hundred people that do that in like a 3-month period. So we really try to personally thank every single one of them. And if we see that they're doing it a few times in a row, then we do kind of reach out and try to include them in our updates as well. I think it's very subtle, but this is the type of thing that's hard to scale without data and some type of tracker. So that's kind of some of the things that we've done. Here's some of the things we measure. So we try to understand vaguely what word of mouth enthusiasm is there. So this is kind of from outside of the community coming in. So we look at percentage of members that post introduction within 24 hours of joining. I think it's currently at like 25 or 30%, up from 10 a few months ago. So my dream is to get to like 50 or 60 would be good. It's hard to make everyone do an introduction. A lot of people are just coming to explore. So it is a high commitment for some people. The other thing that I really like is the percentage of members that join a non-default channel. This is actually from the first community manager of the DBT community, Claire. She has a great blog post on the type of metrics they look at. And I really like this one because this requires non-trivial contribution. You actually joined a channel that you were not just automatically added to. So I think that's kind of a good way to test if people are getting value out of the default channels and they want to join the non-default ones and focus their conversation more. It's just another commitment level. And then orbit levels. So we do look at the key thing with this is you do need to think about redefining them every quarter to 6 months. What level 4 looks like now might be different, down the road. So, but we do have kind of shifting definitions of what this is. So exploring might be just someone who joins, versus level 2 is either answering someone else's question, commenting on someone else's thread, or making a code contributions. The Superset community is interesting is that we have so many personas. We have super technical, open source, DevOps, data engineer types, all the way to more data leaders, product managers that are more interested in getting value out of data than the nitty gritty technical stuff. So we don't want to be too specific and say that contributing is only a code contribution. Because personally, I don't ship a lot of code in Superset, but I do a lot of documentation. So we still count that. So what's next for us? Extending it to adjacent communities. So Superset is a BI tool. We visualize data from databases. So we also want to know when people post issues or comments or notes in our adjacent communities. So this is one of the 50 databases that we work with. Many of them are open source, and so they have GitHub repos, and you can analyze those, which is great. And you can, whenever someone mentions a keyword or mentions your project, you can go in there and respond, and maybe even invite them over to the Superset community, right? So that's kind of a very powerful thing. So don't just think about your community as living in the channels that maybe you own and moderate. Also think about the adjacent communities that people are looking to get help or still feel like this is kind of a community that maybe is living somewhere else. So it's still important to think about that. The last one is cross-channel analysis. So how many people start in Slack and then make it over to GitHub or vice versa. This is tricky. This is probably the trickiest thing that a lot of tools try to do, mostly because people don't use the same email in multiple tools necessarily. And, it's, so it's just difficult to do this type of tracking. It can be unreliable, but I still think, it's valuable, especially for people that are highly engaged. So more resources. So if you're interested in this type of thing, community data and measuring community efforts. I'm a big fan of SWIX, is what he goes by. He has a great post called Measuring DevRel. DevRel is in the title, but it's really just about communities in general. And then go spend time with the Orbit model. It's become the dominant framework for understanding communities. And yeah, I'm a big fan of it. It's been great to help us focus our efforts and to understand where people are in that journey. And lastly, we built, but you can buy. In the last 7 months, there weren't that many tools when I first joined 18 months ago, but since then, there's been at least 10 startups that have raised a lot of money to build a new wave of community relationship management tools. So not CRM in the customer sense, but community sense. So I will not specifically promote. I'm not specifically trying to authorize or say that one of these is the one you should use. I actually don't have a ton of experience with any given tools, but I have met with and seen demos of ComSor, Common Room, Orbit, and they work in similar ways. You give them API tokens and access to your community. They crawl it, they suck in data, similar to kind of what we're doing. And some are more about analytics. Some are more about kind of managing and sending out emails and engaging. So they kind of vary, but if you don't want to do all of the open source data work that we did, an alternative might be to buy instead. So that's it for my talk. I hope people found it helpful. Community is really hot nowadays. It's a very, especially because of COVID too, like there's a lot of challenges I think people have in building online communities. And when you're in person, just like working in person, you don't have to be as deliberate. You can just kind of meet up. There's food, there's drinks, maybe there's some interesting speakers, and that's maybe enough for a lot of people. But when it's online, you have to be a lot more deliberate. Just like when you work remotely, you need to be a lot more deliberate about how certain things happen that you took for granted when people were in person, right? So that's yeah. So I think hope this was helpful. And yeah, I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference as well. Thank you.